Have you ever wondered how someone can be incredibly strong on the outside but vulnerable on the inside? The story of Samson is proof of that. He was the strongest man in the Bible, but his real battle wasn't against the enemies he faced. It was against his own decisions. In this video, you'll discover how Samson went from being a feared hero to a betrayed and humiliated man, and how his journey can teach you to deal with your own struggles. If you've ever felt lost or faced moments where bad choices seem to knock you down, stay until the end, because what you'll learn here can transform the way you see your strength and your purpose. Samson is one of the most fascinating and enigmatic figures in the Bible. From the start of his life, he was chosen by God to deliver the people of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. This calling was given even before he was born, showing that Samson was destined for something great. As a Nazirite, he took on a special vow with God, which included not cutting his hair and abstaining from alcohol. His extraordinary strength, so often mentioned in Scripture, didn't come from his muscles but from his obedience to the vow that connected him directly to God's power. When we look at Samson's story, it's easy to see how unique his abilities were. Imagine being able to face entire armies, driven by the conviction that God was on your side. However, his strength wasn't just physical, it was also a metaphor for the spiritual mission he carried. Like Samson, we are often called to something greater, and our strength can come in unexpected forms. In Samson's case, his hair was a symbol of his consecration, a direct link to the source of his power. Samson's journey makes us reflect on how, even when chosen for a divine mission, daily decisions are crucial. He was God's instrument, but his choices put him in difficult situations time and time again. In our lives, we are often faced with decisions that can either strengthen us or lead us off course. The question is, how are we using the blessings and talents God has given us? Just like Samson, our choices have a direct impact on our journey. What's interesting about Samson is that despite his physical strength, he struggled with human weaknesses. This reminds us that no matter how powerful we may seem in some areas, we all face internal challenges. His story is a clear illustration of how outward power doesn't always reflect inner balance. In Samson's case, his relationships, particularly with Philistine women, showed a vulnerability he couldn't control. This raises the question, are we aware of our own weaknesses and the impact they can have on our purpose? Thus, Samson's life serves as a mirror for all of us. Chosen by God for a mission, he was a giant in strength, but also faced his own inner battles. His journey still holds many lessons, as we'll see in his miraculous birth and the crucial role it played in his story. Samson wasn't an ordinary man from the start. His birth was already surrounded by miracles and divine promises. His mother, who was barren, was visited by an angel who announced the boy's birth, saying he would be consecrated to God from the womb. This is a pattern we see with several important biblical figures like Isaac and Samuel. God often chooses the unlikely, those who seem incapable of achieving great things by human standards. But through Samson, we see that the impossible is just the beginning of God's plans. This miraculous birth brings a strong parallel to the concept of divine purpose. Imagine being someone whose mission was laid out by God even before birth. That was the case with Samson, and it can be the case for each of us. Even if we don't see it clearly, we all have a calling, something greater waiting for us. And just like Samson's mother received a direct message from heaven, often the signs of our mission are already around us, waiting for us to notice them. Samson's consecration as a Nazirite from the womb is a powerful example of how God prepares and shapes his chosen ones. His Nazirite vow included not cutting his hair and abstaining from alcohol, but it was much more than just external rules. It symbolized a life entirely dedicated to God. Like Samson, we are called to consecrate ourselves in some way. It might not involve specific vows, but each of us can choose ways to dedicate our lives to a greater purpose, aligned with the spiritual values we carry. There's something extraordinary about God choosing a barren woman to give birth to one of Israel's greatest warriors. It's proof that God isn't limited by human circumstances. When we look at our own lives, how often do we feel inadequate or limited by the circumstances around us? Yet, Samson's story shows us that human limitations are opportunities for God's power to manifest. He transforms weakness into strength, the impossible into reality. This miraculous birth was the starting point for Samson's extraordinary life. From the beginning, he was destined for something great, something that would transcend his human limitations. But this journey of miracles and strength was just beginning. Now, we'll dive into the first demonstrations of the supernatural power God had given Samson, showing how his life would soon become a series of incredible acts. From a young age, Samson began showing signs of his extraordinary strength, something that set him apart from any other man of his time. One of the first events that revealed this divine power was when he killed a lion with his bare hands. Imagine the scene. A young man confronted by a fierce predator, and without hesitation, he tears it apart as if it were an ordinary animal. This event not only showcased his physical strength but also showed that he was destined to perform great feats that would be impossible for anyone else. This demonstration of supernatural power wasn't an isolated incident. Shortly after, Samson used this same strength to defeat 30 Philistines at once in an act of personal revenge. Here we see that his strength was a direct reflection of God's purpose to free Israel from their enemies, the Philistines. In many ways, Samson's power symbolizes how, when we are aligned with God's purpose, we can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. In Samson's case, this alignment manifested in his incredible physical strength. In our everyday lives, we may not face lions or armies like Samson, but we all encounter challenges that seem impossible to overcome. Samson's story teaches us that when we are connected to our purpose and God's power, we are capable of feats that seem miraculous to others. Imagine having a goal that seems out of reach, a career achievement or a personal dream. The strength to achieve it often comes from a source beyond human effort. Like Samson, it's important to recognize that our strength can come from something greater. However, it's important to remember that this strength wasn't inherent in Samson. His strength came directly from his vow with God, from his faithfulness to his Nazirite pledge. This shows us that, just like with Samson, there is a price to pay for divine strength. It doesn't come just from desire, but from obedience and alignment with a higher purpose. Samson was strong, yes, but because his life was, in theory, dedicated to God. We can learn from him that the greatest achievements come from a life committed to higher principles. These impressive feats made Samson a feared and admired figure among the Israelites and their enemies. However, as incredible as his strength was, his reckless decisions began to jeopardize his mission. And it's here that Samson's path starts to take a dangerous turn, as personal choices begin to compromise his relationship with God and the purpose he was called to fulfill. Despite his unmatched strength and being chosen by God, Samson was vulnerable to his own choices. He began making reckless decisions, especially regarding his relationships. From the beginning, he showed a tendency to get involved with Philistine women, something that was clearly against God's plan for his life and for the people of Israel. His most fateful relationship was with Delilah, a woman who ultimately betrayed his trust in exchange for money, revealing the secret of his strength to the Philistines. This involvement with Delilah teaches us a valuable lesson about the consequences of poorly thought-out decisions. Samson, endowed with divine strength, began to neglect his calling and let his emotions lead him instead of his mission. This can be compared to moments in our own lives when, by ignoring advice and clear signs, we make decisions that jeopardize our greatest talents and opportunities. Like Samson, we are responsible for every choice we make, and these decisions can often lead to difficult consequences. Delilah was persuasive and cunning, and over time she managed to win Samson's complete trust. After her constant probing, he finally revealed the secret of his strength, his hair, the symbol of his Nazirite vow. This revelation shows us how even the strongest among us can be vulnerable if we're not mindful of the influences around us. Samson and Delilah's story serves as a warning for all of us. When we neglect the principles that uphold us, we open the door for our weaknesses to be exploited. Samson's mistake in blindly trusting Delilah not only led to his betrayal, but also to his capture by the Philistines. Here we see how a series of poor decisions can lead to ruin, even for those endowed with great power. It makes us reflect. Are we mindful of the influences around us? Are our decisions aligned with our purpose, or are we allowing our vulnerabilities to steer us off course? With his reckless decisions, Samson lost control of the purpose God had given him. The strongest man in Israel found himself betrayed, captured, and humiliated. But his story was far from over. Even in his greatest weakness, he would still find a way to reconnect with God and fulfill his destiny in a dramatic way. The next stage of his life brings us to the moment when he would lose his strength, marking the lowest point in his journey. After being betrayed by Delilah, Samson faced the most severe consequence of his reckless decisions. While he slept, Delilah cut his hair, breaking the Nazirite vow that connected him to God's power. When he woke up, he found himself completely stripped of his strength. The Philistines, who had been waiting for this moment, captured him with ease. They not only imprisoned him, but also humiliated him by gouging out his eyes and turning him into a slave. The man who once inspired fear and respect had now become a shadow of his former self, reduced to weakness. This moment of loss teaches us an important lesson. When we disconnect from what ties us to our purpose, we lose the strength that sustains us. For Samson, the cutting of his hair represented more than just the loss of a physical attribute. It was the loss of his spiritual connection with God. Likewise, in our own lives, when we stray from the values and principles that guide us, we feel weakened and lost. It's a warning not to take our blessings for granted and to always be aware of our connection to our divine purpose. With his eyes gouged out and reduced to a life of servitude, Samson now faced the full consequences of his choices. However, even in his humiliation, he began to reflect on his life and his calling. As time passed, Samson's hair began to grow again, symbolizing a slow recovery of his faith and inner strength. This shows us that even in our moments of greatest weakness, there is always a chance to start over, to seek redemption, and to reconnect with what truly matters. At this point in Samson's journey, it seemed like all was lost. He had been betrayed, captured, and humiliated, and his strength, once unmatched, seemed like a distant chapter of his life. But physical strength was never the main focus of Samson's story. It was his faith and relationship with God that truly defined his destiny. And even though he was blind and powerless, his faith was beginning to rise again. Just like in our own lives, moments of greatest defeat can be the first signs of an internal transformation. But Samson wasn't finished. He knew he still had one last chance to fulfill his purpose. In his heart, he began to cry out to God, asking that his strength be restored one final time. And with that, Samson prepared for his final act, where his divine mission would be completed in a dramatic and definitive way, bringing the story to its climax with his final revenge against the Philistines. Now blind and humiliated, Samson was brought by the Philistines to a public event, where they would parade him as a trophy of their victory over Israel. Chained between the pillars of the temple of Dagon, the Philistine god, Samson found himself at the lowest point of his life. He who had once terrified his enemies with his superhuman strength now stood powerless, mocked in front of his oppressors. But even in this scene of complete defeat, Samson saw one last opportunity to redeem his mission and his purpose. With his hair growing back, Samson felt that his strength, though diminished, could still be restored. In a moment of deep humility, he prayed to God, asking for his strength to return just one last time. He didn't pray for personal revenge, but to fulfill his role as Israel's deliverer. This moment of sincere prayer teaches us about the importance of faith, even when everything seems lost. Samson knew that, even in his weakness, God's power could still manifest. And so, he made his final request. Samson asked to be placed between the two main pillars of the temple, the ones that supported the entire structure. He placed his hands on them and with one final prayer cried out to God for strength. What happened next was an act of faith and sacrifice. Samson pushed the pillars with all the strength he had left, and the entire temple collapsed on the Philistines inside, killing thousands of them. including the leaders who had captured him. In one final act of power, Samson defeated more enemies that day than in his entire life. This final act of Samson shows us that even in the most desperate situations we can still fulfill our purpose. He reminds us that redemption is possible, and that even after failures and defeats, God can still use our lives in powerful ways. Samson had hit rock bottom, but his faith lifted him up to accomplish what had been predestined since his birth, freeing Israel from the Philistines. His final sacrifice was the ultimate expression of his mission, showing that despite all his failures, he remained faithful until the end. The crumbling temple symbolizes not only the destruction of Israel's enemies, but also Samson's redemption. His strength, which had been lost due to his choices, was restored by God's grace in a crucial moment. He fulfilled his destiny, and his story serves as a powerful reminder that it's never too late to seek redemption and trust in God, even when everything seems lost. Samson teaches us that, no matter the mistakes we've made, there's always one last chance to make a difference. Now that you've learned Samson's story and how he lived between his strength and his weaknesses, think, what can you learn from this? What decisions are you making that may be pulling you away from your purpose? Just like Samson, we all face moments of failure, but what really matters is how we rise. Share in the comments which part of the story impacted you the most and how it relates to your life. Oh, and before you go, have you heard about Ezekiel's vision? In the next video, we'll explore this impressive and mysterious vision. Don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue this journey of discovery.